Kolya let out a puff of smoke into the cold blue air and coughed. On the 4th floor of the old 5-story building below him, a balcony window opened. Out peeked Baba Marussia, a loud, brightly red-haired old woman. She looked up at Kolya, scowled and asked, "Was that you calling me all night, you bandit?" "No," Kolya answered dryly, taking a drag. "I'll give you no!" the old woman snapped. "You're completely brazen. May you die right there." "Shut your trap!" Kolya yelled at her, and accurately tossed the smoldering cigarette butt right onto the old woman's head, hitting the target of her overgrown grey roots. Not waiting for a reaction, he closed the window and went into the room. There he regretted what he had done. He was afraid the old woman might call the cops, and he didn't need any problems. He had spent the last decade and a half behind bars, burglary, grand theft, and a quick relapse, from start to finish, with a note in his personal file like a brand. He had not taken the path of correction. After his release, life seemed incomprehensible. Freedom seemed not to accept Kolya. He tried to get his affairs in order. He managed to get a job as a loader in a factory cafeteria and scraped together enough money to rent an apartment. But despite this, everything around him seemed to scream that a former convict was unwanted here. And now this loud old woman downstairs, she had disliked Kolya immediately, saw the blue tattoos on his fingers, and started blaming him for all the building's misfortunes. Allegedly, he smoked outside her door, or played loud music at night, or rang her doorbell, and quickly ran away. Kolya had tolerated it up to a point, but today his nerves snapped, and the stray cigarette butt flew onto the old woman's head. Now Kolya sat in his room, examining the layer of dust on a bookshelf, and calculating how he would justify himself if the police showed up. The cheap digital clock showed midnight. Kolya scratched his head and stood up to take a shower before bed. But before he could even turn on the water, he heard the doorbell ring. At first, he didn't even flinch because he wasn't expecting anyone. But after a couple of seconds of thought, he tensed up. Was it the cops? Then the bell rang again. The sound was loud, sharp, like a taser, and it severely frayed Kolya's nerves. "It's definitely the old woman. She called them." He sank, pulled on a t-shirt, and went to open the door. "Who is it?" Kolya asked loudly, already taking hold of the key protruding from the keyhole, turning it once and then instinctively pressing his eye to the peephole. But there were no police officers or enraged old women with dyed hair in the hallway. There was one person in a black hoodie with the hood up. He turned away from Kolya's apartment and was already ringing the bell of the apartment across the hall. With a thin, bony finger, he firmly pressed the button, but without waiting for an answer, he quickly turned and headed downstairs. Kolya turned the key back, keeping his eye to the peephole, and suddenly, the person sharply jumped out from around the corner and approached the door. His face was barely illuminated by the yellow light bulb on the landing ceiling, and Kolya couldn't figure out if the peephole was distorting and stretching his features, or if the person really looked that ugly. Against the backdrop of his eyes, his elongated nose looked enormous, and at the very bottom of his face, which was shaped like an iron, narrow lips were visible. A row of upper teeth poked out from his wide mouth, as if the guest was grimacing awkwardly. Yet there wasn't a single wrinkle on his smooth, pale skin, and he couldn't make out any eyebrows. Kolya asked in a low voice, "Who do you want?" The person didn't answer but pressed the doorbell again. Kolya immediately recalled the old woman's recent complaint that he was ringing her bell at night. Kolya even considered opening the door and punching the guest, then dragging him to the old woman and forcing him to apologize. But the familiar feeling of danger touched him, like the cold barrel of a revolver pressed to his head. He feared new problems with the law, and figured the old woman would be the first to report him if he started swinging his fists now. With these thoughts, Kolya stepped away from the door and, ignoring the ringing, shuffled to the bathroom. "Some kind of lunatic," he thought, looking at the rusty strip on the sink. "Keep ringing. It's not me, but someone else will come out and knock your teeth out." Kolya remembered the guest's creepy grimace and shivered. It reminded him of a disturbing story from the internet about eerie creatures from the darkness that gained flesh and slipped into our world. A fragment of that video still echoed in his mind. It sounded something like this. Have you ever wondered if terrifying creatures might be hiding in the darkest corners of the internet? These digital shadows have already taken on flesh and permeated our world, introducing the collection of cursed toys, grips, and their younger siblings. Greeplins. No, these aren't just plush toys. These creations are vessels for chilling stories. Grips are the lost cyber souls of the digital age. Despite their frightening appearance, they desperately long to find their place in our world. This is a real gift for fans of creepypasta and all horror culture. Just look at Skinny. His body is as if stitched from dark matter, and the most frightening detail is the holographic insert instead of a face. From different angles, you will see one of two eerie expressions: a cloudy skeletal face and a distorted green face. Rumor has it that the gaze of this sinister phantom sucks out souls, driving victims to unspeakable terror. Each toy has its unique design, vibrant colors, and memorable, frighteningly cute appearance. Plus, they have these funny protruding bottoms you can press. Choose the one you like best. A collectible card, revealing the character's unique story, comes with every Grips toy. Do you dare to become the guardian of the Lost Cyber Souls collection? They are waiting for their brave ones. Get your Grips and Greeplins now on Viberis. Link in the description. Before going to sleep, he checked the weather forecast on his phone. Rain was promised for the entire next week. That meant the roof would leak again, and the yellow spot in the corner of the room would get even bigger. In a foul mood, Kolya turned to the wall and dozed off. In the morning, he quickly got ready. Rushing to work, he carelessly forgot his umbrella at home and was caught in a heavy downpour in the evening. Cursing everything, Kolya tramped home, put his shoes in the kitchen to dry, and went to the bathroom. It seemed that the long-awaited peace and relaxation had arrived. But the doorbell, as if on cue, started ringing again. Kolya tried not to think about who was standing in the hall. Even if it was the neighbor with the cops, he absolutely had to lie in the warm water, or he risked getting sick and losing his only job. Kolya endured, whispering a foul rhyme he had heard in prison under his breath, and tried with all his might to ignore the annoying guest, but he couldn't. The caller seemed to be reading his mind, choosing such a disgusting, jarring rhythm to completely push Kolya over the edge and force him to open up. After waiting only a couple of minutes, Kolya couldn't take it anymore, climbed out of the water, dried himself, threw on a sweater and sweatpants, and clenching his teeth went to open the door. Grasping the key, he asked, "What do you want?" But the answer struck him in the heart and forced him to drop the key as if it were red hot. "Open up, Kolya. We need to talk," came from the other side. The voice sounded muffled and hoarse, like someone clearing their throat from a morning cold. Kolya was genuinely surprised by the man's words. He asked again, "Are you talking to me?" "To you," the man replied just as strangely. Kolya thought it might be his former cellmate behind the door, but he didn't recognize the face or the voice. And again, a strange feeling overwhelmed him. Only this time it was not like danger. It was something vaguely resembling fear. Everything was disturbing. The guest's appearance, his words, and his behavior. Kolya decided to find something out and asked Gert, "Why were you ringing the neighbor's bell yesterday?" The man, without changing his expression, calmly explained, "Oh, I made a mistake, Kolya. Come on, open up. Why talk through the door? Open up." And he rattled the handle. The iron door rattled as if it too was scared by the suddenness. Kolya looked at his knees. They were also shaking. This hadn't happened to him even on the hardest days of his imprisonment. Something was wrong. Kolya felt it. And the ringing continued, joined by the muffled, hoarse voice from behind the door. "That's it, Kolya. Open up, or else I can climb through the roof. Kolya, open up!" He said the last word a little louder and angrier, causing Kolya to flinch and back away. With a trembling hand, he crossed himself at the door, sincerely hoping it would help. But nothing worked on the guest, and when the ringing stopped briefly, the horrifying words about the roof echoed in Kolya's head. Frozen in terror, he rushed into the room, ran to the curtained window and looked outside. A cold downpour lashed down from the black sky. To be safe, Kolya closed the vent. He calculated how long it would take the guest to climb onto the roof and somehow smash the glass to break into the apartment. But his reasoning constantly stumbled and wouldn't settle smoothly. Kolya couldn't believe he was seriously afraid of an ordinary person, let alone his words. The years in prison had blown away Kolya's fear of people, leaving it through the slightly open window behind the bars. But the trembling from supernatural interference lived in his soul and only became more deeply rooted over time. In prison, Kolya had been religious, feared divine punishment, and worried that he would someday encounter an unclean force. And now he stood, sweating, breathing loudly and quickly, clenching the curtain in his fist. Terror possessed him. New mental fuel was thrown into his brain like a furnace. Kolya was not afraid of people, but he didn't consider the guest a person either. He didn't know why. But with every minute spent in agonizing anticipation at the window, Kolya became more and more convinced the guest was something else. A livid crack of lightning flashed above the trees. 3 seconds later, deafening thunder rolled through the area, and right after it, someone stomped a few times directly above Kolya's head. It didn't sound like someone trying to muffle their steps on the roof while the storm raged. On the contrary, he seemed to be deliberately waiting for the lull to announce himself. Kolya lifted his head, looking at the ceiling. Everything was going devilishly wrong. Lightning in autumn was a very rare phenomenon, just like the appearance of this stranger. It seemed as if nature itself was screaming about the danger. Kolya listened, not knowing what to do with himself. He tiptoed from the room to the kitchen and back, looking at the windows and afraid of missing the moment when the uninvited guest would start climbing in. But he was lost somewhere. The footsteps didn't repeat, and the ringing stopped. Kolya only saw the empty stairwell through the peephole, and it seemed it was time to be relieved, to admit to himself that it had all been a mean and very stupid prank by another idiot. After all, the unclean force would definitely have entered the apartment, as promised, through the roof. The trembling in his hands had barely subsided when Kolya sat in the kitchen and smoked. His temples were still throbbing, and his breathing hadn't yet returned to normal. But after a few minutes of silence, after a mug of hot tea and a sandwich, Kolya began to calm down. The rain outside grew quieter. Only rare drops slapped against the windowsill. Kolya left the light on in the hallway so he wouldn't be lost in the dark if something happened, and lay down to rest. Sleep came quickly without delay. The fear retreated, released his frayed nerves from its tenacious claws, and gently dozed off, hiding somewhere in the corners of his mind. Kolya didn't think about it, though. It passed, he thought, and thank goodness. In the morning it was difficult to wake up. He had a terrible headache. The downpour that had quieted during the night intensified with new force by dawn. He didn't want to go anywhere, and the moment Kolya thought about yesterday, he was immediately covered in goosebumps. He cautiously peered through the peephole several times, looking to see if his nightly was lurking. As soon as a man started leaving the neighboring apartment, Kolya immediately opened his door and rushed out of his own. Awkwardly choosing his words, he tried to ask his neighbor if he knew who was ringing the doorbell at night. The neighbor grimaced and, hesitating, replied, "Baba Marussia said it was you ringing," and quickly glanced at Kolya's blue tattoos. Kolya didn't try to explain himself to him, and saying goodbye, hurried down the stairs. In the evening, he was late leaving work. The shift supervisor wouldn't let him go until all the pallets were unloaded, so Kolya got home 10 minutes before midnight. In the hallway, climbing from the 3rd to the 4th floor, he heard a door opening on one of the floors below, followed by the distinctive squeak of an old doorbell button and a muffled crackle. Anxiety seized Kolya. He continued walking, but every step was a huge struggle, as if a weight from a barbell had been attached to each of his boots. He heard someone shuffling below, a disgruntled sigh, and then Kolya clearly distinguished the sound of someone pressing the button and ringing another apartment's bell. Kolya tried to time his steps to coincide with the other sounds. Thus, creeping, he reached his top floor and stood on the mat, And suddenly, he felt disgusted by his own foolish fear. Taking a deep breath, he put his hand in his pocket and took out the jangling set of keys. The sounds on the lower floors instantly stopped. Someone shuffled on the concrete floor, broke into a run, and their heavy yet fast footsteps suddenly began to approach. Kolya froze, confused, squeezed the iron key with his numb fingers and poked it into the keyhole. But it didn't go in. "Oh," Kolya whined. The key had to be flipped so the teeth were at the bottom. But his hand wouldn't obey, and every movement caused genuine pain. Someone scraped on the second floor, turned, hitting the iron railing, and rushed up to the third. Kolya's stomach clenched, his vision blurred, and a crazy thought hit him. "I need to call the cops." But he immediately shook it off with disgust, automatically recalling his 2 arrests. The steps leapt onto the next flight of stairs, rushing up to the 4th. Kolya bit his lip and sharply jammed the key in, completing the first turn. The runner below was already stomping on the 4th floor. Kolya twitched his hand because he couldn't handle his trembling fingers anymore, grabbed the key with the other hand. The steps with a hollow echo dashed up the stairs. Kolya completed the second turn, pulled the handle and took out the keys. They traitorously flew onto the floor, hitting the iron threshold and clanking, stopped on the mat. Meanwhile, the night guest had reached the landing between the floors. Only 1 flight of 9 steps separated him from his desired goal. Kolya ran into the apartment on shaky legs, crouched down, grabbed the keys from the mat, and slammed the door shut. He completed the first saving turn a moment before the electric crackle of the doorbell echoed through the apartment. Kolya stood with his knees bent, pulling the handle towards himself with both hands, afraid that the lock hadn't turned at all, that he had imagined everything, and the door was still open. But when the handle was pulled from the other side, it answered with a rattle and didn't open, and Kolya felt relief. Sweat running from his hot forehead stung his eyes. Kolya wiped himself with his sleeve and, holding his breath, looked through the peephole. And again the same face, the elongated chin, the deep-set eyes, the strange grimace, and the long schnoz. As if sensing that he was being watched, he stretched his repulsive smile even wider and spoke in a low voice, not as hoarsely as last night. "Open up, Kolya." "Get lost, you scum!" he snapped. "I'll call the cops right now," he said, and spat 3 times over his shoulder. "They won't make it in time." The guest chuckled. "You're not alone at home anymore. Open up nicely." Kolya felt as if he'd been doused with a bucket of water. He flipped the light switch and scanned the corridor. No one. Then he rushed to the kitchen. It was also empty. Knife in hand, Kolya went through the room, bathroom, and toilet. Everywhere was empty. "What are you lying about?" he growled. "There's no one here." "Kolya, did you look under the couch?" The guest calmly drawled and spitefully pressed the doorbell button. Despite the soul-shredding crackle, Kolya moved into the room, immediately turned the corner, dropped to his hands and knees, and looked under the couch, where someone's disfigured face was staring back at him. His heart painfully seized in his chest. A fiery spasm burned his shoulders and throat. Kolya couldn't utter a sound, and silently threw the knife right between the eyes of the disgusting face, which suddenly crumpled. Coming out of the momentary shock, Kolya crawled closer and saw what he had taken for a face. A white pillowcase with red roses, apparently forgotten by the apartment's landlady. For a moment, a weight lifted from his heart, and Kolya exhaled in relief. But soon, again disturbed by the doorbell, he wondered, how did this monster know what was under my couch? But the appropriate answer immediately came to him. The caller needed his terrified victim to run out through the window or through the door. It didn't matter, and then he would catch her. But why? Suspiciously, Kolya looked at the peephole from a distance and spoke a little louder than usual. "What do you want?" "We need to talk, Kolya. Open up." "I've heard that already," he mumbled to himself, completely bewildered, and sat down right on the floor in the middle of the hallway. And the ringing wouldn't stop. This person was particularly focused on Kolya's apartment. Last time he hadn't stood at one door for so long, but now he had been ringing for almost 10 minutes with short breaks. And then Kolya's eyes lit up with a good idea. He got up, ran to the balcony, grabbed the dusty hockey stick standing in the corner behind the old armchair, leaned out the window, and knocked the wooden hook on Baba Marusha's glass. She looked out immediately. "What are you doing, you thief? I'll call the police." And she started deliberately inhaling before screaming. "Mother, wait, this is important." Kolya calmed her. "You said yesterday that someone was ringing your bell. Remember? She mimicked. "You were the one ringing my bell, you bastard. You've completely lost your mind from your vodka." "Baba Marusha, I don't drink. I swear to God. Don't shout. Listen, do you hear them ringing mine now?" "Get out of here!" the old woman protested. "Look what he's talking about. Listen, do you hear it? I'll report you to the precinct officer, you beast. You're completely drunk. For God's sake, be quiet." Kolya hissed and squeezed the stick harder. "Can't you really hear it?" And as luck would have it, the doorbell stopped ringing. Kolya looked at Baba Marusha in confusion, and stumbling over his words, tried to explain everything. But she wouldn't listen, and kept interrupting, constantly resorting to insults. "Mother, go out into the hallway. You'll see for yourself." Kolya couldn't take it anymore, and slammed the balcony window shut. His ears were ringing, and the sudden silence in the apartment began to inspire even greater horror than the incessant ringing had. Kolya went into the corridor, stood by the door, and looked through the peephole. But on the other side there was only darkness. This meant the guest had either turned off the light on the landing or covered the lens with something. Nothing to do. If sight was gone, hearing remained, and Kolya pressed his ear to the iron door. At first everything was quiet, but then a lock clicked somewhere below, and someone left an apartment. Immediately, shoes shuffled behind the door, and quick footsteps hurried down. Kolya returned to the peephole. The landing was perfectly visible. The uninvited guest had indeed been standing there the whole time. A couple of seconds later, a woman's scream and a loud slam reached Kolya's sensitive ear. He swallowed, sincerely hoping the woman had managed to close the door before the guest caught her. Then followed quick footsteps, and a second, slightly quieter slam. And no one rang any bells in the apartments for the rest of that night. However, around 3 in the morning, an ambulance pulled up to the entrance. Kolya woke up anxiously, went out onto the balcony, and watched. A few minutes later, Baba Marusha, covered with a blanket, was carried out of the house on a stretcher. She was alive, waving her arms and saying something to the paramedic. But Kolya couldn't hear anything. He didn't dare open the window at night. The next day at work, Kolya shared his problem with his colleague, Makar, also a former convict. He scratched his head and suggested, "Break into his flat." Kolya was stunned. Makar insisted, "You say he scared the old woman and quickly ran away. But he definitely doesn't live on the 3rd floor because you were on it when he came out from somewhere. I think it's most likely the 2nd. But you still need to ask the neighbors which flat." "Then they'll arrest me." Kolya sighed. "No, brother. You have to find out yourself. But what would I even look for there?" "Who the hell knows?" Makar shrugged. "If he roams at night, he sleeps during the day. That's how it works. Corner him, let him explain himself." Kolya spent 2 hours in thought and finally made up his mind. He asked the shift supervisor for time off, saying he had a terrible stomach ache. On his way home, he met his next-door neighbor and asked him about Baba Marusha. It turned out she was now in intensive care, in stable but serious condition. Kolya shared the events of the previous night and casually asked if the neighbor knew the man in the black hoodie. The neighbor shook his head. "We thought it was you ringing," he said quietly. Then Kolya started asking who lived where. He was taking a huge risk, but he had nothing to lose. And if some was driving old women to the ICU, he definitely needed to be dealt with. However, Kolya wouldn't just be seeking revenge for the spiteful old woman. He had his own scores to settle with the night guest. The neighbor remembered almost everyone except the tenants of apartment number 6. According to him, A very old grandfather used to live there, and then his relatives took him to live with them. The apartment should have been empty. Saying goodbye, Kolya hurried home. His lock-picking skills had not faded during his years in prison. The lock was very simple. To open it, he needed an old battered discount card and a wire that he kept in his room. Returning with the simple tools, Kolya listened. There wasn't a soul in the hallway. He felt for the lock's bolt with the card. It gave way, but not completely. Old spring, Kolya noted. He bent the tip of the wire at a right angle, inserted it into the keyhole, felt for the pins, and began gently lifting them. His hands remembered the job. A light press, a turn, a click. Less than a minute passed before the door yielded. Kolya slowly opened it and entered, holding his breath. Silence hung in the apartment. Same as always, Kolya thought and crept into the nearest room. What he saw there didn't just frighten him. It nearly drove him insane. Photographs were plastered all over the walls, like in a textbook serial killer detective case. A picture of Baba Marusha, circled in red marker, immediately caught his eye. Below each image, a sheet of text was attached with a stapler. Kolya went up to the first one he saw and read. Antipenko Igor Ivanovich, born 1980, October 1st. Below that, the address, apartment number, and floor. And then a terrifying note. Lives alone, no children, relatives, far away, overweight, knee injury, clinical depression, danger zero. In shock, Kolya rushed to Baba Marusha's photo and immediately read the last lines. Lives alone, daughter in another district, rheumatoid arthritis, ischemic heart disease, gossip scandalmonger forgot to close the door 3 times, danger 2. And at the bottom, a note in black marker. Intensive care. Kolya was paralyzed. He stood motionless for a minute and a half, staring at the last word. And then, like an electric shock from a defibrillator, another thought hit him. He looked around, and his eyes fixed on his own photo. Walking closer, he recognized the familiar outline of the factory cafeteria. Someone had photographed him while he was working. The short dossier below read, Lives alone, ex-con, no friends, no family, fears the supernatural, believes in an unclean force, psychologically unstable, rings strangers' doorbells. Danger, dash, performance. Kolya pulled out a lighter and set the photo and papers on fire. They fell to the floor, burning. Kolya waited for everything to burn and stomped the ashes with his foot. For a moment, he felt better. He wanted to burn the other photographs too, but suddenly felt such wild terror that he couldn't even flick the lighter's wheel. It was as if an invisible hand was pulling him by the shirt, straight toward the exit. He walked as if in a trance. His thoughts vanished. The silence pressed on his brain, until a loud police voice commanded, Lie down! 2 men in uniform ran into the apartment, ruthlessly tackled Kolya, and laid him face down on the floor. His neighbor from the landing appeared in the doorway. Covering his mouth in fright, he lamented, I told you, my God. Kolya no longer understood anything. Handcuffs clicked on his wrists, and he was lifted. He was led downstairs in a half-bent state. He didn't hear the officers' voices, or the astonished gasps of the neighbors gathered by the patrol car, or the curses of Baba Marusha's old friends. In his head, like a stuck cassette tape, the electric doorbell in the hoarse bass played in a loop. Open up, Kolya. We need to talk. Open up. Special heartfelt greetings from me to Kiryuka Kol, Nikolai Ovchinnikov, and Mr. Miauze. I wish you all the very best. Be healthy and happy. Thank you so much for your support.